So kia ora everybody, good morning, welcome to Curious Conversations. This is the final Curious Conversations for the year. It's been an amazing run. We started this during the Omicron peak because we couldn't have our community hubs. We couldn't gather people together in community. So we started Curious Conversations and we've had some fascinating people join us. And we have another fascinating person this morning, Jane Wrightson. Welcome. Jane is from Te Ara Ahunga Ora, the Retirement Commission, and she is the Retirement Commissioner. Good morning, Jane. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Morena koutou. Ngā mihi mahana o te wā ki tātou. Ko Jane Wrightson, tōku whenua ko o te mana Ahungarua. I'm Jane Wrightson. I'm the Retirement Commissioner. And I'm just going to share my screen. Yes, that bit seems to have worked. So number one, technology challenge achieved. We'll see how the rest of it goes. It's a privilege to talk with you this morning. I'm going to, broadly speaking, just cover what the Retirement Commission does because people know bits and pieces of it, but not all of it. And, you know, we don't have a massive marketing budget so that you can be deeply enmeshed in what we do. And at the end, I'll open up for questions. So if there are aspects that I cover across that you want to know more about or things that I haven't covered, by all means, ask me at the end of the small prezzo. I was asked to talk firstly a little bit about who I am. That's a fish out of water slide. I was appointed to this job 2.5 years ago. From a 30-year career in media, screen and media, so quite a different space. The connecting tissue on that is that I had run two Crown entities previously, and the Commission is a Crown entity itself. So I knew how to do that, the government end of it. What was completely new to me was, of course, Retirement Commission, retirement policy, financial capability, and all that stuff. So it was more than mildly terrifying. Particularly since I knew how my previous media allies can go for the throat quite quickly. I was Chief Executive of New Zealand On Air before this, which is the public media funding agency, and of the Broadcasting Standards Authority. I've been the Chief Film Censor a very long time ago, and I've run the Screen Producers Association, and all that was after my first 10 years in the workforce, which was TVNZ, so completely different. However, my current organisation, the Commission, was in a bit of a spot of bother, particularly on the government relations front. So I'm assuming that my knowledge of how Crown entities and how they run was seen as sensible. So there you go. What does the Commission do? It's actually got 3 jobs. A number of my friends and media people said when I got this gig, oh, you'll be looking after me in my retirement. And I said, well, yes, but not really. That's the thing. Retirement, as we know, is a long journey, and I'm on the economic side of the spectrum, so I'm about how people are financially capable and encouraged to plan throughout their life, because as you know, retirement or older years comes on you faster than you'd think. So the 3 focus areas are all set down in statute: retirement income policy, retirement villages, and FinCap. The retirement income policies work is largely behind the scenes, except that every 3 years we're required to make a report to government on assessing the state of retirement policies and making recommendations for change. And given that we're not a core public department, getting action on those recommendations can sometimes be challenging. Depends on what they are. We're right in the middle of that now. We'll be delivering the training report in December, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And the advocacy piece of policies has generally not been used that much, but became a bit of a interest area for me last year and this year, when a number of pensioners became trapped offshore when the borders shut, and the process of getting in through MIQ became enormously difficult. And some of you may know that if you go overseas for 26 weeks, you can, but after 26 weeks, your pension will stop, and after 30 weeks, you'll get a demand to repay 6 months pension back. I'm interested in that policy, and I'll be looking at that next year. But meantime, obviously, when the borders shut and MIQ problems started, because MIQ was fine at the beginning, it just wasn't at the end. A number of people were trapped. They were getting pensions cut. They were getting payment demands. The system was very inflexible and unhelpful. It's, you know, at that point you're treated like a beneficiary, so it gives you a window into what it's like being a beneficiary. And it took some sustained advocacy from me and a few others to effect some change. It's been people going through the system who have got repayment demands, and I'm saying to them, do not pay, because by the time they get to appeal, those demands should be waived. So anyway, that's the part of the advocacy piece. That's not a common part of my job, but popped up there, and I'm sure there would be other areas that will emerge over time. Retirement villages, we oversee the framework. We have done a very big piece of work in the last couple of years, which those of you around villages might know, which is challenging for the operators. In effect, what happened when I took the gig on is I saw two sets of people arguing, the villagers and the operators, and these are not the managers, these are the owners, and some residents. And it boiled down to the fact that I believe there's an imbalance of power now. The legislation is 20 years old. It needs to be looked at. Residents are, generally speaking, happy when they're there, but there are issues going in and there are issues going out that need to be looked at. And that's a recommendation to government. Again, happy to talk more about that at the end if that's an area of interest. And financial capability, which is in effect the long path to retirement. How we get people to, once they're not on the breadline, because that's a different conversation, how we get people to think broadly and carefully around their economic position in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And I'm assuming some of you on the call, and certainly me, look back at our 20-something and 30-something selves and think that we could have done a little better for ourselves, and that's true. Again, can talk more about that if you want me to, but those are our three core jobs. What was interesting to me around retirement income policy was that there was no statement anywhere to say, what's the system all about? So it's not on the NZ Super legislation, and it's not anywhere else. And if you don't have an agreed framework for discussing it, then wider discussions around policy, and that's things like the age of super, how much super is, all that kind of stuff, become difficult. So this is the purpose statement that my expert advisory group and I devised over 6 months chatting and thinking. What's interesting is that it kind of sets out what it's all about. And again, I hope that this is helpful to you. It also tells you, well, we'll start, sorry, I'll go at the beginning. So the word stability or stable is really important. My office was invented after the Todd Task Force in the 70s, after there'd been some serious lurching politically of pensions and government policy around this. And what you don't want is a system that changes per government, because that, if anything, will not give you the trust and confidence in the system when you're younger. It won't encourage you to save. And what you need is trust and confidence in a stable system to allow you to think, to believe that you'll be looked after in your older years, which and then will incentivize you to increase your own contribution to that. And this is important because older people need to be treated with dignity and mana, as we know. They need to participate in society and have that participation recognised, and enjoy a high level of belonging. You'll note that there are two parts to the system here. NZ Super, which is the government's contribution to your economic well-being in your older years, and the independent savings piece, which is your own contribution to maintaining the standard of living that you have or aspire to. A two-tier system is okay. Some countries have three. They have a pension, they have compulsory savings, which we don't, and they have voluntary contributions and savings, which we do. So we're not as robust as we could be, and it's why in some ways that our economic position isn't necessarily as healthy as it could be. But this statement is what I'm using in my conversations with government, in particular with Treasury and those kind of places who are generally, you know, not thinking broadly about retirement, to go, this is how, these are the aspects that we need to use to think about. And if it's of interest to you in your own, if anybody's using advocacy work, there you can cite that. Moving on to financial capability for a moment. The language around this does matter. Financial literacy is the actual knowledge that you have. And people say, and in this context, they say, oh, it should be taught in schools, blah, blah, blah. My response to that is, A, it is taught in schools. It's just that people don't understand that, because for a long period it wasn't. And even when it is taught in schools, and it's taught in a different way, it isn't the end of the issue. And the best way to understand that is to say to you, how many of you remember your high school maths or your high school French? You know, and if you've used either of those sets of knowledge, you'll go, me. But the large majority of us do not. In other words, you can learn stuff, but you don't implement it and you forget it, which is why financial capability is the more interesting concept, because this is the lifelong journey. It's what you do. It's how you apply the knowledge that you acquire in a consistent way over time. And financial resilience, which is often talked about as well, is kind of, you know, if you've got the capability, if you've got the literacy, then these are your surfboard for navigating your life on the way through, which will involve life shocks. And life shocks are the ones that set you back. These are the divorces, these are the business failures, these are the health issues, these are the leaky homes, these are the seismic buildings. Whatever hits you and takes a dent out of your cash during your life, if you're resilient because of your preparation, you'll manage that a bit better, and you'll do that because of the capability that you're demonstrating. And then thinking about financial capability in terms of how to apply it. We're using the segmentation model now, which is a useful way of thinking about it, because demography itself, you know, how old you are and where you live, isn't especially useful, given that people can move into different segments over time, depending on their age, depending on what's happening to them, depending if they're in the middle of life shocks, all the rest of it. So you'll see that we've got 6 segments there. The daily distressed, the 12%, are the people who can't put bread on the table. Now, these people are generally Ministry for Social Development clients. They are able to get assistance. They are not having a very good time of it at all, and they need considerable help to get out of that segment. But it's interesting that when you talk about financial capability in a broader sense and start talking about how saving a bit more and all the rest of it might be a good idea, often the conversation defaults to, oh, but the people who can't afford to save at all. And we go, yes, that's right. That's that segment there. There are different mechanisms for them, but the majority of people, most of the time in their lives, can afford to save or think about saving a little better than they do. Social spenders are those that are still in the exposed territory. They're at risk. They are spending money. They're often younger. They're the ones, you know, buying $20 cocktails. But they're young, and it's what you do. But they're at risk and need to understand that. Active budgeters also a bit at risk, that they know how to budget, they're doing it quite well, but there's probably not quite enough money to go around. And so thinking about how to, for instance, have an investment strategy to grow your money becomes quite important. Aspirational acquirers doing quite well, still in the earlier part of their journey, but they need particular help around investment and to not get too sucked into kind of new things like Bitcoin. unless you really know what you're doing. To understand risk is the important bit there. Steady squirrel is doing okay, and they'll be fine unless they hit a life shock, in which case you might see them go back a couple of segments. And the comfortable maintainers, which generally speaking are this generation of retired, who may need help with decumulation, what you do with your money and how you spend your money in retirement, because that becomes a completely different headspace from the headspace you've been in, which is, how do I save my money? The next question is, how do I spend it well and how do I make it last? You know, these are all interesting and difficult and challenging financial capability questions. And as I said, if you know, you may well be in the comfortably maintaining space until you get a leaky, until you decide your house is leaky. And if you're in your 60s or 70s and you get that, you know very well that that's a serious problem. And so you might have to, you know, you'll go back down the segments. Thinking about how the system overall works from an industry and government perspective, there's a thing called the National Strategy for Financial Capability. And the main point around this is to bring together people in the industry, which is the banks, which is the financial institutions, which is government involved in this space. There's a lot of people working around this space. They're not very well connected. Occasionally they're working in opposition to each other, but not too often. But what we do know is that time and money invested in the space could always be used better. So we also bang on a lot about the Nat Strat, which is focused on the people working in the space, with all on the vision that New Zealand understands money. And like all good vision statements, it took us months to get that nailed, because it starts off big, it gets smaller, blah, 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 blah. But then when we really nailed it, we thought the real problem in this country is that New Zealanders don't understand money. They don't understand how to grow it. It's interesting. So if you use that lens, you can start focusing a whole bunch of effort around this. The three pillars around this are consistent content, work together, demystify money, and we do various work streams around the industry and around government to say, could you adapt your work stream, or could you invent a new one to go into this space? And so that collectively the weight of impact becomes better, because the trouble with this is that very little of it's measurable. And that's an issue for those who, for instance, are fundraising or asking for money for charitable work in particular out in the community. The Shifting the Dial projects are the most interesting, really, and that was me being a bit brave, saying we want to do a couple of things every year that will be hard and that people can't do individually but might manage to do together. And I said to the Financial Services Council, which is the industry body for financial providers for most of them, why don't you do me a project focused on one of the target audiences, women, next year? And it's a very male-dominated industry, this, so they looked a bit askance. And then there's a gingery little group on the side called Women in Super who leapt on it as well. And they have just finished a 3-month campaign where a large number of providers over that period did a particular effort around women's financial capability, ran forums, ran webinars, had competitions, all that kind of thing, and just worked together for 3 months. And that was incredibly exciting, because that kind of thinking hadn't really been part of the modus of those organisations, because they're basically there and they're in competition most of the time. So trying to find ways for them to work together for a collective benefit is interesting. And another project we're working on at the moment is not very sexily called the Glossary Project, where we are working on a whole series of words and terms used commonly across the banking, finance and insurance industry in particular, and trying to simplify them so that you and me can understand it because, as you know, one of the great mistakes around this is the language. And I was quite nervous coming into this job, thinking I'll never understand it. It's very hard. It's the finance sector. I have no knowledge of it. And once you unpick it a bit, you realise the core parts of it are actually quite simple. And so that's been one of my drivers, to try and demystify money, simplify it. And the more people understand it, the less afraid they are of it, and the more likely they are to affect change. And why is this important? Because New Zealand, as a country, we are terrible savers. We are terrible savers. The country on the left, if you can't read that, is Switzerland. We're down the bottom with Finland. Finland's all right because it has a high social security net, much higher than ours. And many people will say, oh yes, but we can't save because we're a low wage economy. It's absolutely true. That is why some of the other countries do better. And we have a somewhat better social security net than some of the countries, say, like the US, that you can see there. But nonetheless, it's a challenging, wicked problem. And that's why all this work and thinking becomes really important, because if we don't ingrain savings into our culture better, we are never going to get ahead. A little plug for our own website, Sorted, sorted.org.nz. This is the single source of truth for financial capability information, and it is the site that isn't selling anything. So often you'll see banks and insurers and financial providers referring to Sorted because they'll say, this is the kind of things we think you should be thinking about. Go on to Sorted and check that we're telling you the truth. So this is your trusted source of information. The people on this call may not need this so much, but keep it in mind, particularly when you're dealing with your children, your grandchildren. Put them there. There are tools and blogs and tips and budget calculators and all sorts of things that help you start thinking about what kind of financial capability response you want to have for your own world. Young ones in particular are following social media influencers a lot, and some of them are terrific. But here is the place. Here is the place to say, to go for, if you like, the single trusted source, and we're constantly upgrading it. It's also very simple to use. Going quickly into the Retirement Income Policies Review, we're working on this now. The government gives us the terms of reference. The Shares Terms of Reference has particularly asked us to look at women, Māori and Pacific peoples and their retirement experiences. So you'll see a heavy focus on that. There won't be much of a Kiwisaver focus this year because the government's still working on the recommendations from the last one, which was quite heavily Kiwisaver focused. And obviously because the world has been in such turmoil in the last couple of years, work streams have slowed down, and the response to the last review is one of them. But if we're looking at women in particular, I thought you might be interested in a couple of observations we're going to be making. Because you may have seen a little bit of commentary around this. The situation of women in retirement, no surprise to many of you, is demonstrably worse than that of men. And it's for the obvious reason. The gender pay gap, the wage pay gap turns into the retirement pay gap. The graph on the left, you will see that the general breaks that women take in their career mean that they earn less over their lifetime. And whether that changes from a gender perspective as men do more of the childcare over the next 20 years will be an interesting trend, won't it? But you see the facts around it are kind of incontrovertible. You know, when you think of 50% of people over 65, 50% of women over 65 are earning less than 30,000 a year, which means that's pretty much the pension plus a smidgen, compared to 33%. It's quite fascinating that. Obviously, they're more reliant on New Zealand super, Obviously, we know that women live alone longer, and that means you've got higher costs and a higher period to fund after 65. Women have lower wealth in general, and Pacific women have the lowest wealth. And again, because we have spent less time in the workforce, and some of us, particularly Pacific and Māori women, have had lower pay for almost their entire working life. And you can see this playing out in the gender gap in Kiwisaver balances, right? So the difference in average Kiwisaver balance is quite pronounced at the 36 to 40, 22.5%, which is, childbearing years, and at 51 to 55, 33%, which is probably sandwich generation. You can see that if you look at the 51 to 55 group, you've got a 33% difference in Kiwisaver. The gender pay gap itself is 12%, and the residual difference is 21%. So Kiwisaver, which is a fantastic mechanism, it's the best thing that's been brought into the system for 20 years, nonetheless is a workplace scheme. And so women who have broken work experiences, those who are working on lower wages, those who are working on contract, are going to perform less out of this unless we think about different ways to help top up their balances. And there's a number of ways that people talk about, some of which can be in the purview of government, and some of which can be in the purview of somebody, of somebody's partner. Which brings me on to NZ Super. I am the commissioner that is saying don't raise the age. My previous two predecessors believe that the age should be raised. I don't. It's a position, that's okay. It's a government decision anyway, not the retirement commissioners. My view is that I'm a young boomer. I am still working. My generation, I think, will be the last of the relatively comfortable, because relatively speaking, we own our own houses. We have had a reasonable working life. We have not had an education, but a debt to pay, etc., etc. The generation coming in behind me will be paying off mortgages at 65, almost certainly. They will not have the council, the public housing options that people a little ahead of me have had. So that's a challenge. And they will not therefore have saved as much. So it's going to get tougher. And of course, you've still got the people who have not earned enough during their lifetime. I would have said 5 years ago that the employment prospects for older people were not great past 55, and that would impact my view on the 65 super age. It's not quite the same now because, as we know, the workforce is very light. So there are more opportunities than there have been for a long time for older people to be in the workforce. But nonetheless, if you're going to play with the age settings, my view, thinking all the way back to the purpose statement, is that any change to the settings needs to be looked at in a really principled way, which doesn't mean just defaulting to the age. Because the first question you ask, that usually people say, it has to go up past 65, the country can't afford it. And my response to that is, who says? The country can afford what it wants to afford. And the cost of New Zealand super is somewhat over-egged. The value of it, which is actually the value that older people provide back into their communities, is completely underrepresented. And it needs to be a more nuanced conversation. The second thing is you need to say, if the age is going to go up, who's it going to hurt? And who it's going to hurt are women, Māori and Pacific people for exactly the reasons I've just been outlining. And the third thing you need to think about is that young people often say, oh, well, super won't be around when I'm old. And I go, who says? Governments have been thrown out on that. And this becomes a really big philosophical question around what kind of society do we want? We don't want child poverty, and there's still a lot of work to do there. We also don't want pension poverty, and we do sort of okay on that front at the moment. So when I hear older people who are on the pension go, oh, they should put the age up, I get really cross, because they've got the benefit, just as they've got the benefit of free education, housing that's managed to get paid off before retirement, all that stuff, and they're not seeing the issues coming behind them. And again, going right back to the purpose statement, all this is around trust and confidence in the system. If you need to have the trust and confidence that NZS will be there for you, and that then will, with some nudging, motivate you to make some provision for your own standard of living if you're able to do so. So that's a pretty fast trot of the kind of things that are keeping us awake at night here at the moment. As you can see, it's a bit of a broad church. We're a very small organisation. We're only 35 people. So there are limited areas that we will work in depth, and we stage those so we can manage to service those needs. But I'm really happy to answer questions now and go into areas that I may have covered briefly, that you want some more knowledge about. How's that?
Thank you, Jane. That was fantastic. Very thought-provoking indeed. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen if that's okay, so we can see you in the middle. And you just click stop, I think stop share at the top of the screen there.
Oh, I've done it. Does it not? Still
sharing.
Is it? Oh, all right. My apologies.
There we go. That's
different screen. Two screens.
Right. Now I'm going to, oh, whoops. Oh, sorry. Tech problems. Hang on. Add spotlight. There we go. You see me there?
Yep.
Good. Thank you. I've got a range of questions. We haven't got any in the chat at the moment. So if you've got a question for Jane, pop it in the chat box. There's a little button down the bottom of your screen that says chat. If you click on that, you can type in a question in there, and we will take a look at those. So, Jane, as I said, very thought-provoking. Thank you. I've written down a bunch of questions. My first question is this: one of the things that I think here at Age Concern is, if I could crack the nut of getting a younger generation to think about what it's like to be over 65, I think we'd get a lot more support and a lot more help. We do get a lot of great help from people under 65, and that's I think one of your key focuses areas, isn't it, to try and get those younger generations to think about their retirement. For me, that really only happened when Kiwisaver came in, because then I had to think about.
Yeah, so that sort of. But a little before there were quite big workplace schemes, of course. So if you were lucky enough to work for a large employer or a multinational, you would have had their own super scheme. If you were self-employed or worked for a smaller company, not. So the beauty of Kiwisaver, and it was a very bold thing to do, was that it was transferable across employers. I'd like to see it compulsory. That's obviously a political decision. But it's because it's now opt-out, it's getting quite close to it. And it has been a game changer. And what we found with that was, particularly when the first lockdown happened, when the country did a bit of panicking around toilet paper and Kiwisaver, a lot of the younger people sort of ran to their providers and said, get me out of the fund, I need to go into a conservative fund now, or give me my money back, or the government's taking my money, was my favourite one, as they saw their balances drop. The government's taking my money. And it told us that people had still not clocked that Kiwisaver is an investment fund, not a savings fund. And because we'd had 10 years of money going up, they'd never seen it drop. And of course, it was terrifying. Those of us who lived through the 87 crash and the rest of it went, oh no, it's that again,
Yeah.
So the more education and information and nudging and capability work we can do, the better. But it's exactly like losing weight, giving up smoking, cutting back on the grog, it's behaviour change stuff, this. and people will only do it when they're ready. You can't make them, and they'll generally do it when you prod them at the right time, when they get a life shock, or just when something different happens. So often people are thoughtful when they're having their first child, or when they buy their first house, or something like that. But it is a lifelong journey, and we do take, generally speaking, as human beings, because we're human, we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back quite often.
Yeah. Okay. Kirsten is saying some of the concerns I have come across in retirement are the decrease in social connections due to finishing work and people not having a plan in place to remain connected. Does the Commission spend any time thinking about this?
Not so much, because our focus is on the economic well-being by statute. So that's our job. It's a broader area of interest to us, obviously. And it's, if you go back to the purpose statement, you'll see there was a note there around general well-being, about belonging to a community and all that stuff. So it's acknowledged in there. And so when I go out talking, particularly to younger audiences, I talk about that a lot, because you can see, I've seen it with my own parents. You can see it easily. When you leave the workforce, if you've been working, then your structure has gone, hasn't it? And so you've got to be really disciplined to figure out what you're going to put in place of your work structure. And some people find it really easy and happily capering about, doing what they want to do. And for others, they're bereft. And I've got a feeling I might be in that former category. So, things to learn.
I think it's probably fair to say some people might go back to work for that social connection.
Well, that's why when you hit 65, nobody says you have to stop work. Yeah. Some people can't afford to. Even if you can afford to, it's usually a better strategy to wind down slowly, I would have thought. And with the increasing ability of employers to think flexibly at the moment with the workforce shortage, it's a not that difficult conversation to say, could I go to 4 days a week? Could I go to 3? If I had a 2-day-a-week gig here, is there something contained I could do that would still be useful to the employer? And you can think about that yourself. You don't need the employer to offer you that stuff. You could go to them with a case and go, I love working here. I need to wind down. I'm getting tired. I'd like to do 2 days a week. Could I do this? The initiative is a good thing in this case.
Yes, and the workforce, of course, right now is never been a better time to
never a better opportunity for older workers.
Yeah. Alistair has said, beneficiary versus pensioner. When I started earning in the 60s, the social contract was that 1 6 of every tax dollar paid was put to my future government pension. Do we need to return this concept? I see myself as a pensioner, not a beneficiary.
Yeah, don't know about the concept, but I absolutely understand the beneficiary versus pension thing. I haven't met a single pensioner who likes the description of themselves as a beneficiary. And yet you will see almost every official from MSD and Treasury say there's no difference. They're just beneficiaries of a different type. I tend to think that pensions are a right. And that they should be treated differently. You can wordsmith all you like, but it is why I'm trying to reclaim the word pensioners, actually, because people go, oh, you shouldn't use the word pensioners. I go, why not? A pension is a pension is a pension. A pension is a good thing. It's a good thing the country offers you. And you've got more right to it than any kind of benefit, if you like. It's not means tested. You get it. Almost everybody gets it as long as you pass the residency requirements at 65. So it's the closest thing we've got to a universal basic income. So I personally think some reframing would be quite good. My more drier colleagues in some of the departments probably disagree.
Can I ask you about retirement villages? What kind of changes would you like to see?
We've asked the government to do a review, which they say they're going to begin consulting on at the end of this year. 2 main areas really, and this is because village residents are neither owners nor tenants. They're a unique breed, and since the legislation was brought in 20 years ago, the consumer protections for tenants in particular, and general consumer protections have changed a lot, not in the retirement village space. So there's work that needs to be done around the documentation, around the occupational rights agreements, that kind of stuff. There is much better work that could be done to make people very aware of the decision they're taking. For many people, it's a brilliant choice. For some people, it's disastrous. And it's disastrous when you try and leave more than anything else. If you move into a village where you don't like your neighbours, that is quite problematic unless you're quite wealthy, because getting out of a village, you'll lose 30% of your capital, and you may not be able to buy back into the private market, or you may not be able to transfer to another village easily. So you've got that issue to think about. And if you're worried about what you're leaving to your family, you also need to think about the debt in your capital. The flip side of that is, of course, you get a really nice place to live. You don't get the hassles of home ownership, all the rest of it. So there are competing tensions here. What we want to see is clearer, more plain English documentation. We'd like to see more competition in the sector. If you've ever got into one, you'll understand that the occupational rights agreement you sign, your lease, if you like, you've got no negotiating power at all, pretty much. So that's interesting. And the complaints and disputes area needs a big overhaul. It's messy, it's complicated, there are many ways of going in. It's a system that's tapped on over time, and it's not good for the residents, and frankly, it's not good for the managers. It lawyers up too fast. And smaller complaints, not the frivolous ones, just smaller ones, may not be dealt with as simply as they could be.
Could you just explain the relationship between the Retirement Commission and the Aged Care Commission? You work together on these?
A very good question. Caroline Cooper's only just been appointed into that role this year. In effect, hers is a health focus, and mine is an economic focus, right? So if you're thinking in the villager space, I'm in the retirement villager space, but she's in the aged care space, or the aged care beds. So we will cross over occasionally, but not very often, I think. And the trick to that, of course, is, so it's a bit like a Venn diagram, you know, with the joining bit in the middle. We just need to understand where we overlap and don't duplicate unnecessarily. But if you think of us as me, money, her, health, there it is.
Okay. You talked about stability of the system, and I guess one thing that troubles me, I guess, about our country is every 3 years we have an election, and you know, often the new government come in and change a whole bunch of stuff. How stable is the system, and you know, do you worry about a new government coming in and just sweeping the floor or whatever, changing everything?
Only a little bit. I mean, you know, frankly, governments are elected beasts. I'm not, and so an elected government, and then Parliament will do what it does. It's been stable since the creation of my office. I don't think that's necessarily the same thing. And the introduction of Kiwisaver has, thank God, been accepted well by all parties. So that's a good thing too. It's common for parties in opposition to say raise the age of super. It's common for the government of the day to change its mind on that when they become elected, because it's not a very popular thing to talk about. And all I can do around that is advocate for principled decision making, right? If a government makes a decision around something that I disagree with, well, it's entirely their right to do. My job is to say there are a number of issues here, a number of aspects. You may be looking at it from a political lens, but the political lens is not the same as a government lens, and these are the things we have to talk about. And so, if you like, I've got an informed advocacy role in the space, but that's all it is. You know, Parliament has supremacy here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jane. We've come to the end of our time today. We really appreciate your time and your insight into retirement. It's been fantastic for me. I've learned a lot this morning. So I trust that everyone else has enjoyed the time. Thank you again for joining us at Curious Conversations, everybody. We'll be in touch next year. There'll be a winter session. And Kirsten, we're going to say something. Hang on a sec. I'll just.
I know you almost forgot me.
Yeah. Kirsten's going to say something.
Thanks so much, Jane. That was really fantastic. Yeah, it's just so good to have you with us for half an hour or so talking about, you know, demystifying some of the stuff that people stress about over their life. I'm in that 50 to 55 group, that sandwich group, and yeah, something that's top of mind at the moment is I'd like to retire tomorrow, but I know that I can't afford to do that, so I need to keep working. But yeah, a couple of things that you said that I just wanted to mention. Thank you so much for your advocacy of our seniors who were overseas during, you know, lockdowns and things, who got stuck and needed, you know, their income to keep coming in to survive. So thank you for that. I really loved the purpose statement that you guys have put together, and, you know, we talk about the same sort of things around dignity and mana, and so that's really cool to see that stuff. I am also going to be sending my 19-year-old son towards the Sorted website and making
Very
sure
good.
that, yeah, he's got no clue at all how to deal with his money. So yeah, he'll be spending a bit of time in there on his week's break from Polytech this week. So thank you so much, Jane. Yeah, I hope you have a good rest of the day, and yeah, thanks for your time.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you. It's been a privilege to join you all. Have a good week.
Thank you.